So today I want to talk about one of the things that I believe is one of the most detrimental and hindering aspects of relationships. The thing that keeps relationships from growing and flourishing to their fullest potential. Sometimes chokes relationships out from the beginning and doesn't even let them get started. And it's that V word, vulnerability. Haven't met too many people who like vulnerability. Opens you up to being hurt, opens you up for the possibility of heartbreak, of loss, and the list goes on. But where there's no vulnerability, there's no possibility for a successful relationship or a long-lasting relationship. And to give you an example, let's just talk about earth, right? You have earth and you try to plant seed. What happens when you take seed and you try to plant it in dry, brittle ground? Well, sometimes you can't break the ground up enough to get the seed in deep enough to even plant. That's the relationship not even started. Then you have the seed that you break up the ground and you put it down, and because it's dry and brittle and full of rocks and everything, it'll sprout up real quick and die quicker. But you don't have any seed in brittle ground that is going to grow and flourish because there's nowhere for the roots to take up shop, to grow. The roots can't go down in anything. So therefore, if there are no roots, there can be no flower. The flower can't stand up without the roots. So look at vulnerability as the earth that emotions, love, and trust have to grow in. And if there is no vulnerability, there is no place for love, trust, honesty, and truth to take root. So the relationship is either not going to get started or it's going to flourish and then it's going to die off. So understand that if you are not vulnerable, you can kiss any form of relationship goodbye. I mean, and like in brittle land, weeds might form, them things that aren't really flowers. I don't know what weeds are actually classified as, but we don't seem to like weeds, and weeds don't seem to be beneficial, and weeds seem to choke out everything else. And so some of us have relationships that are not flowers, they're just weeds. They're the rough, terrible parts of ourselves that were able to grow in that brittle ground without any vulnerability. And it's a tumultuous relationship, but a relationship that never seems to be happy, that relationship where we can never seem to talk to each other well, or we never really understand each other because there's no vulnerability. And so just like earth has to be watered, and then it has to be sunshine to help the flower grow. And so it just doesn't take earth, it takes some other things. So in relationships, what represents the sunshine and the water? It's the truth and the trust. See, if there's no truth and there's no trust, vulnerability is always going to be brittle and hard, and you're going to have to break your back to get through it. So understand, you can say, I don't want to be vulnerable, or being vulnerable is terrible, and I got to find a way to be in a relationship and not be vulnerable. Any relationship that is not tumultuous, that is not backbreaking, that is not a question of why am I in this? There is some measure of vulnerability, because that is the only way the roots of trust, love, and truth can grow. And so understand, if you don't want to be vulnerable, you don't want to be in a relationship. Not really. Saying that you want to be in a relationship, but saying you don't want to be vulnerable is like saying you want to go swimming, but you don't want to be in water. Yeah, you don't really want to be in. And if you don't have water, if you don't have sunshine, that earth is eventually going to again become brittle and hard. So some people get in a relationship and they give a little bit of vulnerability. They give a little bit of vulnerability and an initial little bit of trust, a little bit of water. And that just gives enough room for a little bit of the root to start growing down. But then it grows stagnant. And then you're like, why won't my relationship grow? Because your vulnerability died. And there's no place for love, truth, and trust to take root. You have to be open. And this is the main part is I want you to get. That vulnerability is something that should be given carefully, on some level cautiously. In other words, not in fear or in worry, but in carefulness, the same kind of carefulness that you'll check a chair before you sit down in it, that you might check a spot on the ground before you sit down on it to make sure there's no ants or anything crawling around. The same way that you might check a seat before you sit down to make sure it's clean, the same way that you would check out anything before you use it. Like look at a spoon or a fork before you put it in your mouth to make sure it's clean. Not in some fearful manner where you're like, oh my goodness, I got to make sure, like a germaphobe, but in a manner where you're just like, you know what? I'm going to use this for something. And if I'm not careful about what I'm using, I could do damage to myself. And so you just do your due diligence. So vulnerability requires that you do your due diligence, that you assess the person and say, you know what? I feel comfortable being vulnerable to you. Or I don't feel comfortable being vulnerable to you. And at that point, accept that there's not going to be a relationship until you can be. But if you're not vulnerable, if you're not open, you are brittle, dry land attempting to plant seed and have it grow. It's either not going to grow, it's going to grow up and die quick, or it's just going to be a bunch of weeds that chokes out the flower of the relationship. So understand, no vulnerability, no relationship, no trust and no truth, you're going to have brittle ground. And there'll be no place for truth, love, and trust to take root. Just saying. Think about it.